Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Dad Nobody Cares What You Say About New York podcast. In this podcast, I'm going to look at what some might say is a totally self-inflicted problem by the New York government, and that's the crisis caused by legalizing cannabis. So this episode is called Just Say Yes to Cannabis. A bill was passed by Albany lawmakers in 2021 that allowed all New Yorkers who were 21 years and older to own, transport, buy, smoke and consume up to 3 ounces of marijuana and 24 grams of any form of concentrated cannabis product. These can be vape pens, oils, butters, whatever. This bill is called the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. And it decriminalized possession and was supposed to set up a framework of how to sort out all the rules about cannabis. Most importantly, it set up 2 boards, one called the Cannabis Control Board and the other the Office of Cannabis Management. And these are supposed to oversee all cannabis-related rules in the state of New York. So although cannabis has been legal in New York since 2021, the actual situation on the ground relating to licensing, growing, and the general access of cannabis in illegal shops is a huge problem. So although selling cannabis is basically decriminalized, it's not quite legal because there are loads of shops that have opened up all over the city, and these are not licensed, and therefore they have a lot of problems with quality control and supply. I've done quite a lot of research, and the most interesting thing that I've come across is the minutes of the Office of Cannabis Management, or the OCM, of their last meeting in July of this year. And in that meeting, you can see all the members of the panel. Well, not all the members of the panel were there. The governor, Kathy Hochul, wasn't there, and neither were many other members of the board. A few people were there. But what struck me as really telling is that quite a few of the members of the board didn't really seem to even know what was going on and were asked by various people what was going on, and they didn't have an answer. They relied on a couple of people in their committee who did know what was going on, but it was almost embarrassing to see members of the committee having to ask, what is this about? How is that to be interpreted? And getting it wrong. So you wonder that if the main board that is supposed to be looking after this cannabis legalization is so amateurish and they don't kind of really know what's going on, it's probably no wonder that the whole rollout of legalized cannabis has been basically such a disaster. So far, I believe there are only 16 licensed dispensaries in the whole state of New York. This vacuum has caused an estimated 1,500 semi-illegal smoke shops to open up in the city alone. When I got to New York in July, I was really astounded to see how nearly every street corner had one of these smoke shops. I was wondering when I first saw them why they're selling so many hookahs in New York these days. By hookahs I mean these Middle Eastern methods of smoking tobacco. It was only later that I realized when I was talking to my cousin that they were in fact selling weed. I saw these shops were pretty disgusting and dirty in most cases. Some of them were very good and looked very professional with multicolored signs and very funky sounding names. But what did strike me was that they looked a little bit like the illegal cannabis business was suddenly out in the open, and they weren't exactly the most professional shops that you can imagine, and the people running them didn't look terribly professional either. I noticed too that most of the people going into these shops were very young people. They certainly weren't 21 years of age. Now, of course, there's no point having legal cannabis without having some sort of control. And the OCM, the Office of Management for Cannabis, has tried its hardest to think about what they can do about cracking down on these unlicensed sellers. And so far, they've only just started doing a very, very small amount. The whole point of having legalized dispensaries was that it was supposed to make sure that everything sold was legal. That was meant that it was licensed by the New York State, it was cultivated in New York as well, and that you could make sure that everything you were buying had been legally tested, it was labeled for potency, it was taxed, and that you weren't going to get anything inside this product that would be bad for you. If you go to an illegal smoke shop, you'll be able to buy packets of weed in multicolored packets that are very child-friendly in some cases, so clearly designed to attract young people. There won't be any warnings, there won't be any ingredients, there'll be nothing to protect the people taking it. So in a way, it's as bad as it was when cannabis was illegal. And yet these shops are selling them now on the open street in front of everyone, and there's very little enforcement or no enforcement that I can see. So what is the improvement here? The bottom line is that marijuana is still in the United States of America considered to be a Schedule I controlled substance. And that means that the federal government still considers it to be one of the most dangerous and addictive drugs with a very high potential for abuse. And also that there is no currently accepted medical use for it in the United States. Now, this completely puts it out of step with New York. 38 states have now legalized marijuana for medical purposes, and 19 that now permit it for recreational use. So really, I think it must come as quite a surprise to Americans and non-Americans to hear this, and that they even want to try it because they now think it is legal. What is going to happen with the future? Well, a lot of federal and state levels are having discussions about medical research and the impact of the drug on people in society, particularly young people. But for now, it seems that there's just a free-for-all, and it's destined to be a continued mess until somebody does something about it. Back in the 80s, the phrase, "just say no to drugs," was coined, and it became a national symbol of people trying to control what was considered to be the scourge of taking drugs in young people. I called this podcast "Just Say Yes to Cannabis" because it seems to me that the legislation now that's been passed and the attitude of the New York government is to say yes to cannabis as much as possible because of its revenue-producing opportunities. Americans spend nearly $100 billion every year on illegal drugs. Americans, probably at least 50 million of them, smoke marijuana. That's 18% of people. But I'm just very interested into the big question. Why this sudden rush to legalize cannabis? Who stands to benefit the most? And what was the point of it all? On the face of it, you would think that the government just wants to legalize it so it can take a shadowy illegal industry, bring it out into the open and tax it. So the first thing that I decided to do was to try to find out who stands to get the most out of the growing of cannabis. Now, there are a few very, very big companies in the United States: Curaleaf, Innovative Industries, Green Thumb Industries, Verano Holdings, etc., Cresco Labs. They're almost acting like big tobacco companies like Philip Morris. They have massive resources at their disposal, and they're lobbying Congress with mighty amounts of money. Curaleaf alone in 2023 has given over $280,000 in political donations to Congress. They gave $900,000 in 2019, which makes sense because that was just before legalization came about and they probably needed the most political pressure. 20 cannabis growing businesses in the United States of America alone count for over 21 million of political donations. One of the strongest arguments that was used about legalizing cannabis was that by giving it to proper laboratories and proper licensed developers, you would get rid of the illegal drug lords and the on-the-street business that was causing so much pain and misery in the state of New York. It was thought that perhaps even the illegal companies would try to become good people and turn into legal suppliers of cannabis. None of this has happened. It's just that the people who are illegally selling cannabis don't necessarily have the skills to move into legal trading. And it's often forgotten that the drug trade is not just about drugs, it's also about fraud and burglary and fencing and human trafficking and a whole range of other industries. So cannabis and drugs is just one of many industries being looked after by organized crime and the drug lords. The cannabis black market is thriving, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, today, in September 2023, I heard there are now probably 4,000 illegal cannabis shops operating in the state. They operate openly now through these unlicensed shops. Another big argument that was given to people to try to legalize cannabis was that having a health impact would be great, that all the mental health issues and all the various difficulties caused by high dose types of cannabis would be stopped because it would be better controlled. But sadly, as you look into it, there's been really no proper research done into the mental health effects, although there is a lot of stuff that's been investigated by different universities over the years. But it's very, very hard to do proper tests on drugs that are illegal. How are you supposed to check if things are right if it's illegal to even check it? Well, it's quite clear from the research that I've done that mental health, schizophrenia, paranoia, and various unknown health consequences are a major problem, and there aren't enough people investigating what effect this is going to have long term. Another area that was supposed to have been helped by the legalization was to reduce social inequality in the enforcement of cannabis. In the old days, disproportionate amount of the black and Latino community were victimized because they were smoking marijuana or producing it. This legislation is specifically designed to try and sort of, in a way, positively slant to their favor the communities that were penalized before the production and sale of cannabis, so it would help make up for social inequality of the past. All of this was supposed to mean that the health of people would be better. It was argued that it was less harmful than alcohol, and most of all, there would be taxes, because no longer would it be an illegal industry, it would be a legal industry, and they would be able to collect taxes. Very strong arguments were also made that by legalizing cannabis, you would save money in the prison system and the processing and enforcement of crime. There would be less need for police to be arresting people. There would be less problems in the streets. But in fact, because of all the illegal shops that are opening, it's turning into a real headache. Who is going to enforce the rules? Who's going to go into these shops and close them down or serve them with violations? Who's going to be responsible for removing all the illegal cannabis? So there are so many issues there. People are growing cannabis who are not licensed to grow cannabis. People are importing cannabis out of state into New York, which is completely against the rules. All cannabis should be grown within New York. Another area that really has been forgotten is that cannabis is extremely addictive. And nobody really has been thinking about the results to New York society of creating so many potentially new addicts. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just limited to the problems of the user or even the retail seller. It's the farmers, the small farmers who are struggling to either grow enough or get permits and licenses to grow their material. And the ones who actually make it are struggling to find a market, since at the moment there are only 17 legal dispensaries in the whole of New York State. So if you actually look at the meetings of the OCM, they gave farmers, I think, a 2-minute slot each to come forward and complain about what's going on. And it's really incredibly onerous on farmers at the moment, because they find that they have such regulation that it's very, very hard to sell their product legally. Many farmers are selling at a loss. And then one must think that if they have that potential of selling at a loss, are they actually being honest and really selling it on the white market? Or is it very tempting to try and sell their stuff on the black market? The costs of producing cannabis legally are huge. You have to pay for laboratories to control the quality. There have to be microbiology labs that be able to see if there are any form of pest or disease that could be inside it. And the granting of licenses requires also a huge amount of red tape. Naturally, the farmers really want to try to sell their products in other markets. They would like to go to farmers markets or perhaps sell them in cafes like in Amsterdam. They would love the opportunity perhaps to be able to sell their cannabis out of state. But none of this is allowed. The whole process was set up under the CAURD, C-A-U-R-D shops system, and you have to apply for a CAURD license in order to be able to sell this stuff, which is almost at medical cannabis quality. But in many respects, these small farmers just cannot compete with the huge national farmers, and they're pushing them out of the market because they have such huge financial muscle. To a big cannabis grower, a lot of the requirements are very easy to live up to. But to the small ones, being able to produce a minimum of 1,000 pounds of cannabis or remove the stems before it goes into manufacture is a tremendously onerous thing for them. There is a fungus called aspergillus. It's a very common fungus. Apparently, according to one of the growers, it's on just about everybody's hands. But the state is so nervous about putting anything in their cannabis that could cause problems and potential lawsuits in the future that they make every farmer remove this. And this can cost tens of thousands of dollars in specialized machinery. And again, it's almost becoming out of reach for the small farmers to be able to afford that stuff. This social equality argument meant that it would skew the ability for minority groups to be involved far more than, say, the white farmers. Now this is already causing problems. There have been lawsuits because the veterans are being kept out of it, or white farmers are being kept out of it. They feel that just because people were historically disadvantaged, isn't it not discrimination now to be, putting the white farmers at disadvantage, or people who are perfectly able to grow and have got, very good records, no crime, nothing. How are they supposed to get into the market if it's only being given to people who were socially disadvantaged in the past? It sounds like a very laudable policy originally, but it's not working in practice. Another really rather shocking thing I learned watching the meetings was that if you're starting up a licensed dispensary, the New York state government wants money out of you. They want $5 million right up front before you actually even open up your store. And then they want another $10 million as you open your second and third store. And then $10 million after you started making revenues in the future. So these are huge barriers to entry to small people. Now, part of the argument to legalize cannabis was that the state said, well, just think of all these revenues that we're going to get and what we're going to spend it on. They said that they were going to spend 40% of the revenues after costs on the state lottery fund for educational purposes, which sounds fantastic. They were going to spend 40% on community reinvestment and 20% on helping with drug treatment and public education. But none of this is really happening because with only about 18 legal dispensaries in New York, there's not a lot of revenue that's coming in. Right now, as we speak, there's like 1 in the Bronx, 5 in New York, 1 in Queens, and none legally in Brooklyn. So really the only way that you can legally get cannabis in a place like Brooklyn is to be a registered patient for medical cannabis. But if you do a Google search for cannabis shops, you find these dispensaries all over the place, legal and illegal. But as I said, no legal ones in Brooklyn. So again, if you can't buy it legally at the moment, they thought, well, let's let people grow it. But even that's confusing because technically you're allowed 6 plants at a home. 3 have to be immature and 3 can be mature. A household is allowed no more than 12 plants. But again, I wonder how on earth are people going to be checking on that? Especially since the arguments were that they would be reducing the need for policing and enforcement, all the money that was going to be saved by not having to pay for these costs. Well, then who's going to be going to every single house in every single region of New York to check if people have got no more than 12 plants growing in the house? So with all these early problems with cannabis in New York, I thought it would be worth just looking at how things have gone in other parts of the world where maybe lessons have been learned with the legalization of cannabis. Most people know that Amsterdam legalized cannabis many, many years ago. for the over 18s, that is. But they never went to the stage of actually fully legalizing it for everyone. In fact, right now, they're getting very nervous about what they did because Amsterdam has a reputation for being the sex capital and drugs capital of Europe, which is not the most desirable branding for a place that wants to become a responsible city with business, conferences, and tourism. This partial legalization has not really helped things in terms of sorting out criminality either. In fact, the black market in Amsterdam is stronger than it's ever been. Illegal drugs are absolutely booming. In Amsterdam, you have to be over 20 and you have to go to licensed coffee shops. It's not available anywhere else, technically. Most interesting is Thailand, because in June 2022, Thailand decriminalized the production, sale, and personal use of cannabis. And having lived in Malaysia and Singapore myself, you find that incredibly funny since you can be executed for having even a tiny amount in those countries. But things seem to be working out okay. I mean, there are 3,000 legalized retail outlets in Thailand, so they've done it very quickly. They also have allowed the production of cannabis and the import of cannabis from places like California. So they have no blockages to where they get their drugs from. Black market prices have actually fallen still way below the legal dispensary prices. But in response to that, at least you're probably knowing that you're getting some good quality stuff. Illegal drugs such as meth has probably declined. And it seems that, yep, it is true what people were worrying about, that the young people are shifting to cannabis, but at least they're shifting away from harder drugs. Nearer home for my American listeners, Colorado in the United States of America has been allowing legalized cannabis for over 10 years. And in that time, they've grown the business, the legal business, to nearly $2 billion a year. And they found that now 24% more people are using it than used to use it when it was illegal. That's the early studies showing that legislation has increased the use. But funnily enough, there doesn't seem to be any great evidence that driving under the influence or crime has exploded as people feared. And some feel that, in fact, drug deaths have actually declined since legalization. Now, those people who have used cannabis or its products know that it has tremendous pain and inflammation-reducing properties. But, there has also been the evidence that it can damage the mental health of growing brains. Nevertheless, people are turning to cannabis for many, many reasons. But you'd think, again, from the arguments against, that it's going to create a whole generation of couch potatoes. People are going to sit there watching television, eating crisps. It hasn't happened. Apparently, people use it when they're working out. There is good evidence that it's having quite the opposite effect, that people who are smoking cannabis or using cannabis properties are not being affected negatively at all. So, what are my lasting conclusions from all this investigation? It really seems that we've created an industry in New York that wants to maximize profits. The government wants to maintain its tax revenues. The big drug companies and tobacco companies that seem to be behind the production of cannabis want to grow bigger and bigger. And eventually, of course, people who've got the funds and want to open legal dispensaries hope also to cash in. But it seems that there are really no proper studies, no proper investigation into the health impacts. And there is already a lot of discussion about the increased rates of emphysema, learning delays in adolescence, and probably some problems with crime. It's got to the point now that people in New York are actually saying we should probably have more regulation and better oversight. David Jernigan, who's professor of health, law, policy and management at Boston University, was quoted as saying that we're in a massive natural experiment and we are learning the lessons from alcohol, tobacco and other drugs where we have to regulate cannabis. But are we regulating it, he said? Absolutely not. One of the big issues is that the price of legal cannabis is much higher than black market cannabis. So the black market in New York is absolutely flourishing. The whole legalizational process has become so complicated, so it's created a vacuum, and of course, always in these circumstances, the vacuum will be filled by black market. The government is obviously determined to make as much tax revenue as they can, So in New York, they level a 13% state tax on cannabis. This was projected to produce nearly $56 million in 2023. But in fact, it's producing millions less because they don't have enough shops. Of course, one wonders, why did they choose a tax rate of 13% when normal sales tax in New York is 4%? And then when you add on the New York state tax of 4.5%, you never ever pay more than 8.8% sales tax on any other food or beverage. So isn't it a bit ridiculous to be charging 13%? And it's no surprise, therefore, that the cost is much higher than illegal street cannabis. As I finished the podcast, I was reading that actually today there has been a big case in New York where a judge has upheld a restraining order to prevent licensed dispensaries from opening. So at the moment, as of the 4th of September 2023, no new dispensaries can open. I saw an interview with some poor guy who spent every penny he has, and he still has rent, he still has insurance and all his other costs, trying to open a dispensary called Turp Brothers in Astoria. The guy is just beside himself because he's done everything that he was asked to do, but he just cannot open his shop. The bills keep coming in. And this is because veterans have said it's not fair. They're not allowed to get involved in the cannabis industry, even though they consider themselves to be upstanding members of society. And that's because the original idea of the New York cannabis legalization was to give preference to those who used to be socially excluded before. So right now, there are 17 licensed dispensaries, 200 licenses have been granted, 4,000 illegal dispensaries are open, and the whole system is absolutely out of control. It seems to me yet again that if you want to mess something up, you get the government involved. And if you really want to mess something up, you pass laws and try to enforce them. The genie is out of the bottle. There's no going back on this. You can't start legislating against cannabis again because you'll just be back to where you started. So I would suggest the best thing to do would be to reduce the tax, reduce all these barriers and entry for growers, reduce all the red tape and the costs for people who want to either grow or to sell cannabis. So eventually the prices on the street will be as low as the black market, and then eventually the black market will go. Rather like tobacco and alcohol, again, it's going to be too late for us to assess all the damage that it could be doing to people. It's out. It always has been. But even now, while it's legal, not enough research is being done to find out the health effects and what could be done to mitigate that. And lastly, it's quite pointless while you've got 4,000 little illegal shops around New York. It's quite pointless trying to restrict the selling of this stuff just to legal dispensaries. You've got to be able to open it up to all sorts of other markets, such as farmers markets or street cafes or wherever else people want to sell cannabis. But that is fraught with danger. And one of the great compromises the government had to make during the legislation was that it didn't want people to be selling it in farmers markets or in open places because the 50% or so people who thought cannabis legalization was a good idea versus the 50% who didn't, don't really want the smell of cannabis in the street wherever they go or to see people smoking cannabis in the parks in front of their children. But as I found in Cologne, it's not legalized, it's sort of decriminalized for a certain amount for personal use. You can't stop it, and every time I go home, I go past skate parks or wherever else, and you smell cannabis in the air. So my recommendation is to get the state out of the control of this cannabis legalization as much as possible. Allow the free market to take over. Investigate the problems that it can have for health. Invest money in trying to mitigate that. Make it as freely available for sale as you can. Reduce the taxes to a much lower amount so you can undercut the illegal shops that are opening all over New York. They're everywhere. And unless something is done about it now, the situation is not going to improve. None of the benefits of the saving of law enforcement are going to come true. Otherwise, mostly people will carry on buying their cannabis from the illegal shops. And it's not right because you don't know what's in this stuff. I was talking to my wife and she said, to be honest, I know that the kids are going to be smoking cannabis. and I would much rather spend a little bit more money going to somewhere where I knew what they were smoking wasn't going to be really bad for them. So just say yes to cannabis has been a total disaster because all it's done is generate nothing but more problems than it set out to cure.